History doesn't just happen, it unfolds like a chain reaction. One event triggers the next, setting off ripples that reshape entire civilizations. In this video, we're going to explore 15 real domino effects where a single shift set history on an irreversible path, transforming the world in ways no one could have predicted. Let's start with number 15, the invention of the telegraph and the acceleration of global communication. Before the 19th century, communication over long distances was slow, expensive, and unreliable. Messages had to be carried by horseback, ship, or messenger, often taking weeks or months to arrive. This began to change with the invention of the first electric telegraph, which enabled near instantaneous communication over huge distances. The first successful long-distance telegraph line was developed by Samuel Morse and Alfred Vail in the United States in the 1830s and 1840s, culminating in the historic transmission of "What Hath God Wrought" from Washington, D.C. to Baltimore in 1844. This seemingly isolated technological breakthrough sparked a series of developments that reshaped global communication, commerce, and diplomacy. Telegraph networks quickly expanded across the U.S. and Europe. By the 1850s and 60s, telegraph lines connected major cities, revolutionizing how governments, businesses, and newspapers operated. Stock markets began to synchronize, military leaders received real-time intelligence, and news could be distributed with unprecedented speed. The next major domino was the laying of the transcontinental and transoceanic cables. The first successful transatlantic cable was completed in 1866, connecting Europe and North America. This reduced the time it took to transmit messages between continents from several weeks to a matter of minutes. For the first time, global empires could manage distant colonies in near real time, and international diplomacy could happen at a new pace. The impact was not purely logistical. It changed how people thought about distance and time. It became the backbone of global finance, and it was instrumental in the formation of modern news services like Reuters and the Associated Press. Eventually, the telegraph led directly to the development of the telephone, wireless radio, and ultimately, the internet. Each new system built on the concept of instantaneous communication over huge distances, an idea that began with electric pulses over copper wire. In this way, the telegraph set off a chain reaction that continues to define our information age. Number 14, the Fall of Constantinople and the Age of Exploration. On May 29, 1453, the Ottoman Empire captured Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. This decisive victory had massive implications for trade and global power structures. As the Ottomans took control of the city, they gained control of the overland trade routes between Europe and Asia, including the Silk Road. Goods like spices, silk, and precious stones became harder for Europeans to access due to new tariffs, political barriers, and higher risks of conflict. This disruption in trade caused a huge economic shift in Europe. Merchants and rulers began searching for alternative sea routes to the east. Portugal and Spain, two maritime superpowers, heavily invested in navigation, shipbuilding, and exploration, and this led to the voyages of Bartholomew Dias, who rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, and Christopher Columbus, who sailed west in 1492, searching for a new route to Asia, and instead encountered the Americas. Now, the domino effect didn't stop with exploration. The discovery of the New World led to rapid colonization, the transatlantic slave trade, and massive wealth accumulation by European powers. It also resulted in the collapse of indigenous societies across the Americas through conquest, disease, and forced labor. Meanwhile, the new global trade routes began to form, and the shift from land-based to sea-based commerce altered the balance of power, elevating Western Europe as the center of global economic activity. It also allowed for the spread of European languages, religions, and political systems to the far corners of the world. The fall of a single city, Constantinople, ultimately reshaped the entire world map. It closed one chapter of history and it just opened another, setting in motion a period of exploration and transformation that would define the next 5 centuries. Number 13, the 1973 oil embargo and global economic recession. So in October of 1973, members of the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, led by Saudi Arabia, imposed an oil embargo against the United States and other nations that supported Israel during the Yom Kippur War. This result was an immediate and dramatic increase in oil prices and a chain reaction that deeply affected the global economy. At the time, Western countries were heavily dependent on imported oil. When supply was restricted, prices quadrupled within months. This led to fuel shortages, long lines at the gas station, and widespread panic. The cost of transportation and production surged, pushing inflation rates to double digits in many developed countries. In the United States, inflation topped out at 12% and unemployment rose to nearly 9%. The embargo marked the end of the post-World War II economic boom. Many economies entered a period of stagflation, a combination of stagnant growth and high inflation that was thought to be impossible under then-prevailing economic theories. Central banks, unsure of how to respond, experimented with interest rates and monetary policy, often with limited success. Industries dependent on oil, like automotive manufacturing and aviation, were hit hard. Governments introduced new fuel efficiency standards and alternative energy discussions gained momentum. Japan, lacking domestic oil, made significant investments in energy-efficient technologies, setting the stage for its dominance in automotive and electronics manufacturing during the 1980s. This embargo also changed geopolitical alignments. The West realized the vulnerability of relying on Middle Eastern oil, prompting efforts to diversify energy sources and strengthen domestic reserves. The U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve was created as a direct result. Meanwhile, oil-rich countries experienced a surge in income and influence, allowing some to modernize rapidly. In the broader economic landscape, the 1973 oil embargo demonstrated how a single policy decision, limiting oil exports, could trigger a global crisis. It also proved that economic power could be used as a strategic weapon, altering how nations approached both diplomacy and energy policy. The aftershocks of this event continue to influence international relations and energy strategies to this day. Number 12. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and the outbreak of World War I. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary and his wife Sophie were assassinated in Sarajevo by Gavrilo Princip, a 19-year-old Bosnian Serb nationalist affiliated with the Black Hand, a secret organization that supported Slavic independence. This single event set off a series of political and military decisions that would result in the deadliest conflict the world had ever seen. Austria-Hungary, blaming Serbia for the assassination, issued an ultimatum demanding a crackdown on anti-Austrian activity. Serbia complied with most but not all of the demands. With Germany's support, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia on July 28, 1914. Within days, Russia mobilized in defense of Serbia. Germany, in turn, declared war on Russia. France was pulled in as Russia's ally, and Germany's invasion of neutral Belgium brought Britain into the war. What began as a regional incident rapidly escalated into a global conflict involving over 30 countries and resulting in more than 16 million deaths. The domino effect here was not just political, but structural. The web of alliances formed in prior decades meant that the assassination created a cascade of mobilizations and war declarations. None of the nations expected a full-scale global war, but each move prompted a counter-move, locking them into a conflict few could escape. The long-term consequences here were profound. The war redrew the map of Europe, ended four major empires, the Ottoman, Austro-Hungarian, German, and Russian, and set the stage for the Russian Revolution. The Treaty of Versailles, which ended the war in 1919, imposed harsh penalties on Germany. These terms created deep resentment and economic hardship, fueling the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. Thus, one political assassination in a small Balkan city triggered a war that reshaped the 20th century. Without that single act, it's likely that the structure of Europe and the world would have evolved very differently. Number 11. The invention of the printing press and the Protestant Reformation. In the mid-15th century, Johannes Gutenberg invented the movable type printing press in Mainz, Germany. While other forms of printing existed earlier in Asia, Gutenberg's device allowed for mass production of written text in Europe with unprecedented speed and efficiency. One of the first major books printed was the Gutenberg Bible, completed around 1455. But the real domino effect began decades later. By the early 16th century, the printing press had spread across Europe. It drastically reduced the cost of books and made written materials accessible to a much wider audience. This democratization of information played a key role in religious, political, and cultural revolutions. In 1517, Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, challenging the Catholic Church's sale of indulgences. His criticisms would likely have remained a local theological dispute had it not been for the printing press. Luther's ideas were copied, translated, and distributed widely. Within months, thousands of copies were circulating in Germany and beyond. The result was the Protestant Reformation, a religious movement that fractured the Catholic Church's authority across Europe. Entire nations broke from Rome. In England, Henry VIII established the Church of England. In Switzerland, John Calvin's teachings gained traction. Religious wars, persecution, and reform movements followed across the continent. The Catholic Church responded with the Counter-Reformation and the Council of Trent. Meanwhile, literacy rates increased as people sought to read religious texts in their native languages. This encouraged education reform and the growth of vernacular literature, which contributed to the rise of national identities. This domino effect, triggered by Gutenberg's invention, didn't stop at just religion. It changed how knowledge was created, shared, and preserved. Scientific papers, political treatises, and philosophical works began to reach broader audiences, laying the foundation for the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution. The printing press may seem like a technological advancement, but its real impact was ideological. It empowered individuals to challenge institutions, access knowledge, and spread ideas, creating chain reactions that transformed European society in ways that no one at the time could fully predict. Number 10. The fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union. On November 9, 1989, the Berlin Wall, a long symbol of the Cold War and the division between the East and West, was unexpectedly opened after a miscommunication by a government spokesperson in East Germany. Thousands of East Berliners approached the wall, and border guards, unprepared and without clear orders, allowed them to cross freely. Within hours, crowds dismantled sections of the wall, marking one of the most iconic moments in modern history. What followed was a rapid and irreversible domino effect across Eastern Europe. The fall of the Berlin Wall emboldened citizens in other Soviet satellite states to push for change. Within weeks, communist regimes in Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania began to collapse under public pressure. Revolutions, protests, and political reforms swept through the Eastern Bloc. By 1990, Germany was formally reunified. Meanwhile, nationalist movements gained momentum inside the Soviet Union itself. Baltic states like Lithuania and Estonia declared independence, while unrest spread to Georgia, Ukraine, and other republics. Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika, meant to modernize the USSR, only accelerated its unraveling. By December 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. 15 republics became independent nations, and the geopolitical map of Eurasia was redrawn, and the Cold War ended without any direct military conflict between the superpowers. All of this can be traced back to a single event, the fall of the Berlin Wall. And while pressure had been building for years, the sudden breach acted as a trigger that sent decades of reform and rebellion into motion at once. What had once seemed immovable, the Iron Curtain, fell in less than 2 years. Number 9. The Boston Tea Party and the American Revolution. On the night of December 16, 1773, a group of American colonists, some disguised as Mohawk warriors, boarded 3 British ships docked in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of British East India Company tea into the water. This event, known as the Boston Tea Party, was a direct protest against the Tea Act passed earlier that year, which allowed the British East India Company to sell tea directly to the colonies, effectively undercutting colonial merchants and reinforcing Parliament's right to tax the colonies without their consent. While the financial loss of the tea was pretty substantial, the real damage here was political. This act of defiance sent a message to Britain that colonial resistance was escalating beyond petitions and pamphlets. In response, the British Parliament passed the Coercive Acts, referred to by colonists as the Intolerable Acts, in 1774. These laws closed Boston Harbor until the lost tea was paid for, revoked Massachusetts's charter, and allowed British soldiers to be quartered in colonial homes. These measures were intended to isolate Boston and force submission, but had the opposite effect. They unified the colonies. The First Continental Congress convened in 1774 in September, bringing together representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies to coordinate a response. This was the first time the colonies acted in concert, setting the stage for greater political unity. While they initially sought reconciliation, the measures they proposed, like a colonial boycott of British goods, were seen by Britain as rebellion. So tensions continued to rise. By April 1775, open conflict erupted at Lexington and Concord. British troops sent to confiscate colonial weapons clashed with American militia, triggering the first battles of the Revolutionary War. The dominoes fell quickly after the fighting began. The Second Continental Congress formed the Continental Army, appointed George Washington as commander, and began printing currency. In 1776, the colonies formally declared independence with the signing of the Declaration of Independence. International consequences soon followed. France, eager to weaken its rival Britain, entered the war in 1778 to support the American cause, providing troops, naval power, and funding. Spain and the Dutch Republic followed suit. The conflict became a global war, with fighting in Europe, the Caribbean, and India. British resources were stretched thin. The American victory at Yorktown in 1781, backed by a French military support, led to the Treaty of Paris in 1783, recognizing the independence of the United States. But the impact of the Boston Tea Party and the revolution it set in motion extended far beyond North America. The American Revolution inspired other independence movements, including the French Revolution in 1789. Revolutionary ideals of liberty, representation, and resistance to tyranny gained traction across Europe and Latin America. Thus, a single act of protest in a colonial harbor triggered a series of escalating responses that not only led to the birth of a nation, but also helped ignite a global rethinking of authority and governance that would continue into the modern era. Number 8. The invention of the cotton gin and the intensification of American slavery. In 1793, Eli Whitney patented a machine called the cotton gin, designed to remove seeds from cotton fibers more efficiently than manual labor. Though simple in design, the cotton gin could clean up to 50 pounds of cotton per day, an astronomical leap from the 1 pound processed by hand. This innovation changed the economy of the American South, and it triggered a cascading series of developments that would ultimately contribute to the Civil War. Before the cotton gin, cotton was a labor-intensive crop with limited profitability. The time and manpower required to remove sticky seeds made large-scale cotton production impractical. But with the cotton gin, growers could now cultivate short staple cotton, a variety that grew well in the interior South, and process it quickly. The result was a boom in cotton farming. The growth in the cotton production, however, came with a sharp increase in the demand for enslaved labor. While some had believed Whitney's invention might reduce the need for slaves, it had the opposite effect. Plantation owners now needed more labor, not to clean the cotton, but to plant, pick, and process vastly larger quantities of it. The domestic slave trade exploded as enslaved people were sold and forcibly relocated from older states like Virginia to new cotton plantations in the Deep South. The cotton gin also shaped U.S. territorial expansion. As the appetite for cotton land grew, so did the push to acquire and settle new territories, often at the expense of indigenous peoples. The Indian Removal Act of 1830, signed by President Andrew Jackson, led to the forced displacement of Native Americans from valuable cotton lands in the Southeast, most notoriously through the Trail of Tears. Politically, the expansion of slavery into these new territories became a focal point of national crisis. Legislative attempts to manage the issue, like the Missouri Compromise of 1820 and the Compromise of 1850, only delayed the inevitable. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 and the violent clashes in Bleeding, Kansas showed that the country was on a collision course. By the 1860 presidential election, Abraham Lincoln's anti-slavery platform galvanized Southern fears that their economic system was under threat. 11 states seceded from the Union following Lincoln's election, triggering the Civil War in 1861. But the Civil War would ultimately lead to the abolition of slavery with the 13th Amendment. But the legacy of slavery and the economic and social systems it built remained embedded in American society. The cotton gin, a mechanical device intended to improve efficiency, set off a chain reaction that reshaped the nation's economy, intensified racial oppression, redrew political boundaries, and contributed directly to one of the bloodiest conflicts in U.S. history. Moving on to number 7, the introduction of gunpowder in Europe and the decline of castles. So the arrival of gunpowder in Europe in the late Middle Ages triggered one of the most profound transformations in the history of warfare. What began as an imported curiosity from the East quickly became the cornerstone of military strategy. The use of gunpowder-based weapons ultimately rendered centuries-old military designs, especially the medieval castle, obsolete, ushering in a new era of centralized states, professional armies, and radically changed cityscapes. Gunpowder originated in China, with its earliest known formulation appearing as early as the 9th century. Initially, it was used for fireworks and rudimentary explosives. Its military potential soon became clear. By the 13th century, knowledge of gunpowder had spread along the Silk Road to the Islamic world, and from there into Europe. European military thinkers, alchemists, and tinkerers wasted little time in adapting this explosive compound to weapons. By the 14th century, European armies had begun fielding crude cannons, known as bombards, that could fire stone or metal projectiles. Although early gunpowder weapons were unreliable and dangerous, they did present a completely new tactical problem for defenders. For centuries, castles had served as the ultimate fortification: thick stone walls, high towers, and defensive moats designed to resist siege engines, ladders, and archers. But bombards could smash stone walls from distances and eventually reduce even the most formidable fortress to rubble. The domino effect began with the recognition that old defensive systems no longer worked. The Siege of Constantinople in 1453 is one of the most famous examples of gunpowder's new role in warfare. The Ottomans, under Sultan Mehmed II, employed massive cannons, most notably the Hungarian-designed Basilica, to breach the city's legendary Theodosian walls. After weeks of bombardment, the walls fell, and with them, so did the city and Byzantine Empire. The message to the European rulers was clear: no structure was invincible against cannon fire. Gunpowder transformed the battlefield too. Infantry armed with muskets and the arquebus, early handheld firearms, began to replace heavily armored knights as the dominant force in European armies. The traditional feudal levy gave way to permanent professional armies trained to use firearms and gunpowder artillery. Battles shifted from charges of mounted nobility to disciplined lines of soldiers firing volleys in formation. In the realm of thought, the gunpowder revolution challenged long-held assumptions. Traditional military theories rooted in chivalry and siegecraft gave way to scientific approaches to ballistics, fortification, design, and logistics. Military engineering became a formal discipline, attracting some of the brightest minds of the Renaissance. Figures like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo were hired to design forts and artillery, blending science, art, and warfare in ways previously unseen. The introduction of gunpowder in Europe set off a sweeping domino effect that reshaped not just warfare, but the entire political landscape of the continent. Castles, once the defining symbol of medieval power, became relics. In their place rose star forts, professional armies, and centralized states. The nobles lost power, monarchs gained it, and the world moved from a feudal to an early modern order. The echoes of this transformation are still visible today in the way states are organized, wars are fought, and cities are built. Number 6. The launch of Sputnik and the space race. On October 4, 1957, a metal sphere the size of a beach ball was launched into Earth's orbit from a site in Kazakhstan. Weighing just over 180 pounds, Sputnik 1 was the first man-made satellite ever successfully placed into space. Its launch by the Soviet Union marked a turning point in history, not just in terms of science and technology, but in the global balance of power, military strategy, and education policy. What began as a single satellite orbiting Earth triggered a cascade of international developments that would come to define the Cold War era and reshape modern civilization. The geopolitical backdrop to Sputnik was already tense. After World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as superpowers with fundamentally opposing ideologies. Both nations had nuclear arsenals, global alliances, and a mutual distrust that permeated every aspect of foreign policy. Technological superiority became a proxy for dominance, and each side sought to demonstrate its capabilities through increasingly ambitious feats. When the USSR launched Sputnik 1, it stunned the world. Many in the West assumed that the United States was ahead in science and technology, yet here was tangible proof that the Soviet Union could not only match US capabilities, but potentially surpass them. Sputnik transmitted radio signals back to Earth, allowing anyone with the right equipment to hear its steady beeps. More importantly, it demonstrated that the USSR had mastered rocket technology capable of launching objects into orbit. That's a capability closely related to intercontinental ballistic missile technology, or ICBMs. The dominoes began to fall immediately. In the United States, Sputnik was met with awe and fear. If the Soviets could launch a satellite, then they could likely deliver a nuclear warhead from space. American media dubbed it the Sputnik crisis, even though the satellite itself posed no direct threat. What it represented, though, was far more significant: the possibility that the United States was falling behind in the technological arms race. President Dwight D. Eisenhower initially tried to downplay the launch, but public pressure quickly forced the U.S. government to respond more assertively. Within months, Congress passed the National Defense Education Act of 1958, which poured billions of dollars into science, mathematics, and engineering education. That same year, the U.S. established the Advanced Research Projects Agency, or ARPA, now known as DARPA, to ensure American technological leadership. Most significantly, though, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, was created in 1958, consolidating civilian space efforts and signaling a formal commitment to competing in space. The space race that followed became one of the defining competitions of the 20th century. Just a month after Sputnik 1, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 2, this time carrying a living creature, Laika the dog, into orbit. Though Laika died during the mission, the feat once again pushed the envelope of what seemed possible. In 1961, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space, orbiting in Vostok 1. The United States, having suffered several launch failures, was forced to accelerate its own space program. In response, President John F. Kennedy made a bold commitment in 1961 to land an American on the moon before the end of the decade. That goal gave rise to the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo programs, culminating in Apollo 11 and the moon landing in 1969. The domino effect even reached international diplomacy. Countries not directly involved in the US-Soviet rivalry began to see space as a domain of strategic interest. The United Nations created the Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, which helped craft the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. This landmark agreement, signed by both superpowers and many other nations, declared that space exploration should be conducted for the benefit of all humanity, prohibited the placement of nuclear weapons in orbit, and it restricted national claims to celestial bodies. So, the launch of a small metal satellite triggered a worldwide transformation. It reshaped the Cold War. It launched the space race, redefined education and science policy, accelerated technological development, and it helped create a world where space is central to daily life. What began as a single beep from orbit became the opening salvo in a new era of global competition and cooperation in the final frontier. Number 5. The Fall of the Roman Empire and the Rise of Feudal Europe. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the late 5th century CE wasn't just the end of a political entity, it was the catalyst for one of the most profound transformations in European history. This single event did not simply conclude the classical era, it triggered a centuries-long series of developments that led to the rise of feudalism, the restructuring of land ownership, the fragmentation of political power, and the shaping of medieval Europe. What followed was not just a decline, but a reordering of civilization's foundations. By the height of its power in the 2nd century CE, the Roman Empire spanned much of Europe, North Africa, and parts of the Middle East. It had centralized administration, professional armies, a standardized legal system, and a huge road network that tied its diverse provinces together. Latin served as the lingua franca to the west, Greek in the east. Roman law, currency, and culture were deeply embedded in the daily lives of citizens. However, cracks in the imperial structure became increasingly visible by the 3rd century. Economic instability, military overreach, internal corruption, and a declining slave-based economy began to weaken the empire. External pressures from Germanic tribes like the Visigoths, the Vandals, and the Ostrogoths further strained resources, and the division of the empire into eastern and western halves in 285 CE under Emperor Diocletian was a short-term solution that laid the groundwork for future separation. The Western Roman Empire faced the bulk of the incursions. Rome itself was sacked in 410 CE by the Visigoths under Alaric. This shocking event, unthinkable for centuries, signaled a major psychological and strategic blow. In 476 CE, the deposition of the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, by the German chieftain Odoacer marked the conventional end of the Western Roman Empire. The Eastern Empire, based in Constantinople, would survive as the Byzantine Empire for nearly another 1,000 years, but in the West, the dominoes began to fall. Roman cities, once bustling centers of administration, commerce, and culture, shrank or were abandoned entirely. In their place rose rural manor estates, these self-sufficient units controlled by local lords. The villa system of the late Roman Gaul provided a template for the medieval manor, and roads fell into disrepair and long-distance trade diminished. Charlemagne, crowned emperor of the Romans in 800 CE by Pope Leo III, represented a partial attempt to revive centralized imperial authority in the West. His empire covered much of Western Europe and reintroduced administrative structures, literacy campaigns, and law codes. However, it fragmented after his death, and Europe reverted to a feudal patchwork. Over time, however, stability began to return. By the High Middle Ages, that's about 1000 to 1300 CE, population growth, urban revival, and increased trade led to the emergence of new towns and merchant classes. Universities were founded, drawing on preserved Roman texts and integrating knowledge from Islamic and Byzantine sources. The Crusades, beginning in 1096, reconnected Europe with the Eastern Mediterranean, reviving trade routes and cultural exchange. So with the fall of the Western Roman Empire, it set off a complex and far-reaching domino effect that redefined Europe. Though often portrayed as a descent into darkness, this period also laid the groundwork for future revival, innovation, and the eventual rise of modern European states. The echoes of Rome's fall, they're still visible in today's legal systems, languages, and institutional frameworks. That's an example of how one empire's collapse reshaped an entire continent. Number 4. The rise of the Mongol Empire and the opening of Eurasian trade. In the early 13th century, a nomadic warrior from the steppes of Central Asia united scattered tribes and launched a military campaign that would result in the largest contiguous land empire in history. That man was Temujin, better known as Genghis Khan. The rise of the Mongol Empire is often remembered for its brutal conquests, but it also triggered one of the most significant domino effects in global history, the unification of Eurasia under a single political network known as the Pax Mongolica. This event didn't just redraw maps, it reshaped the movement of people, goods, and technologies. It enabled long-distance trade and communication between Europe, the Middle East, and East Asia on a scale never before seen. Before the rise of the Mongols, Central Asia was a region of fragmented nomadic clans and rival khanates. The Silk Road existed, but it was hazardous, segmented, and frequently disrupted by regional conflicts. In 1206, Temujin was declared Genghis Khan, or universal ruler of the Mongol tribes. Within decades, his army had conquered vast areas of territory, including northern China, Central Asia, and parts of Persia. After his death, though, in 1227, his successors expanded the empire further, westward into Russia, the Middle East, and even as far as Eastern Europe. One of the most important consequences of the Mongol rule was the establishment of the Pax Mongolica, a period of relative peace and security across the empire during the 13th and 14th centuries. Mongol rulers established legal codes and standardized weights and measures, and maintained courier systems across thousands of miles. Armed guards protected trade caravans, and the empire created a passport system known as paisi to grant safe passage to merchants and emissaries. Yet one of the darker consequences of all this increased connectivity was the role of the Mongol Empire in the spread of the Black Death. The bubonic plague is believed to have originated in Central Asia and was carried westward by Mongol trade routes. In 1346, Mongol forces besieging the city of Kaffa in modern-day Crimea reportedly catapulted plague-infected corpses over the city walls. From there, fleeing Genoese merchants carried the disease to Europe, where it killed an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of the population. The decline of the Mongol Empire began in the late 14th century. Internal divisions, succession crises, and local rebellions fractured the once unified territories. The Yuan dynasty was overthrown by the Ming in 1368, and the Ilkhanate collapsed due to a lack of strong leadership and economic instability. But the legacy of the Mongol expansion didn't disappear. The networks they created continued to influence global trade. The idea that East and West could be commercially linked persisted, and it would later be realized again during the Age of Exploration, when European navigators sought sea routes to Asia. In terms of long-term impact, the rise of the Mongol Empire initiated several key historical trajectories. It demonstrated the potential of continental integration before the modern nation-state. It reshaped demographic patterns through both prosperity and plague, and it opened the minds of people from vastly different cultures to the idea of a broader, interconnected world. Genghis Khan's unification of the Mongol tribes set in motion a series of historical transformations that helped lay the groundwork for the modern world. Number 3. The invention of the steam engine and the acceleration of colonialism. The invention and refinement of the steam engine in the 18th century marked a moment in world history. It was more than just a mechanical innovation. It did fundamentally change how people, goods, and armies moved around. It reshaped industries, altered global trade routes, and made the extraction of resources faster and more profitable. But most significantly, it dramatically accelerated the expansion and dominance of European powers. Once steam power became widely applied to transport and manufacturing, it triggered a cascade of political, economic, and military developments that reinforced the imperial grip of Britain, France, and other powers over huge areas of the world. The early forms of steam technology were developed to solve a specific problem: how to remove water from coal mines. In 1712, English inventor Thomas Newcomen built the first practical steam-powered engine to pump water from mines in Britain. It was slow and inefficient, but it worked. Several decades later, James Watt significantly improved upon the design in the 1760s and 70s. His engine was more efficient and could power rotary machines, not just pumps. This shift from moving a simple up and down pump to a rotating engine opened the door to broader industrial use. Production moved from small workshops to large-scale operations. The need for raw materials, cotton, rubber, coal, and iron, increased dramatically. And with that need came the urge to expand outward, often into new territories. The steam engine also had major implications for military operations. European armies could now move quickly by rail to trouble spots. During the 1857 Indian Rebellion, for instance, British forces used steam-powered railways to crush resistance in a matter of weeks rather than months. Steamships, too, allowed gunboat diplomacy. That's warships that could appear suddenly along coasts and rivers to demand compliance. This was used effectively by Britain and China during the Opium Wars, where steam-powered naval superiority helped force open Chinese ports under unequal treaties. Now, it's important to note that this domino effect wasn't limited to technology alone. It was linked with ideologies, particularly those of racial superiority, capitalism, and nationalism. Steam-powered enabled the infrastructure that supported those ideologies: the extraction of resources, the movement of labor, and the enforcement of colonial rule. Railroads and colonies were rarely built for the benefit of local populations. Instead, they connected mines to ports or plantations to administrative centers. Indigenous societies were restructured to serve imperial economies, often with devastating consequences. The competition over steam-powered colonial dominance also contributed to rising tensions between European powers. The scramble for Africa in the late 19th century was, in part, fueled by the logistics and confidence that steam infrastructure would provide. As each empire staked its claim, conflicts became more likely. In some cases, a railway construction itself became a pretext for an annexation or war. Well, the invention of the steam engine did more than just power factories or locomotives. It set off a complex chain of events that reshaped global politics. The domino effects included faster military conquest, deeper economic exploitation, and more extensive cultural displacement. While it brought industrial prosperity to Europe, it also entrenched inequalities that continue to shape the post-colonial world today. Steam power made the modern empire not just possible, but profitable for a time. Its legacy is still visible in global infrastructure, economic systems, and in the uneven contours of modern developments. Number 2. The Meiji Restoration and the Industrialization of Japan. When Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States Navy sailed into Edo Bay in 1853, he didn't just force the Tokugawa shogunate to open Japan's ports, he inadvertently ignited a transformation that would shift the balance of power in Asia and trigger a domino effect with global implications. Less than 2 decades after Perry's black ships appeared on Japan's shorelines, the Meiji Restoration of 1868 dismantled the feudal system. It restored imperial rule and initiated a sweeping program of modernization. Within just a few decades, Japan transformed from a secluded agrarian society into a centralized, industrialized empire. This transition, unprecedented in its speed and scope, wasn't simply about domestic reform. It reshaped geopolitics in the Asia-Pacific. It disrupted centuries of Chinese dominance, and it laid the groundwork for Japan's future military expansion, including its role in World War II. To understand the magnitude of this shift, it's important to examine what came before it. For over 250 years, Japan had been governed by the Tokugawa shoguns. That's a military dictatorship that maintained peace through strict social hierarchies and near total isolation from the outside world. The policy of sakoku limited foreign influence and banned Japanese citizens from leaving the country. Christianity was suppressed there, foreign trade was restricted to a small Dutch outpost in Nagasaki, and power remained decentralized. One of the first major steps was the abolition of feudal domains and the creation of prefectures governed by centrally appointed officials. This allowed the government to exert direct control over the entire country, something the Tokugawa regime had never accomplished. The samurai, once a privileged warrior class, were stripped of their stipends and replaced with a modern conscript army modeled after European examples. The education system was overhauled too. The Meiji leaders established compulsory elementary education, created Western-style universities, and sent students abroad to study science, engineering, and governance. Literacy rates soared, and the education system became a key driver of its modernization, producing a generation of engineers and military officers trained to serve the new state. Infrastructure development was rapid. The first railway line between Tokyo and Yokohama opened in 1872, and by the turn of the century, Japan had a national rail network. Telegraph lines, postal systems, and modern ports were constructed too to facilitate both commerce and state control. Crucially, military modernization was a top priority. Japan adopted a Western-style conscription army, introduced universal military training, and imported weapons and techniques from Europe. The first impact of this transformation was immediate. In 1894–95, Japan fought and won the First Sino-Japanese War, defeating China's Qing dynasty and gaining control of Taiwan. This victory stunned people all over the world. For the first time, an Asian power had decisively defeated a traditional imperial power, and Japan's triumph signaled the decline of China's regional dominance. A decade later, Japan defeated Russia in the Russo-Japanese War, 1904–1905, a shocking outcome that marked the first time a non-Western nation had defeated a European great power in modern warfare. By 1910, Japan had fully annexed Korea and was a rising imperial power. The domino effect set in motion by the Meiji Restoration was now evident across Asia. Japan's success, though, came at a cost. As its industrial economy grew, so did its dependence on foreign resources like coal, oil, rubber, and iron. This resource dependency would become a driving force behind future expansion, including the invasion of Manchuria in 1931. But in retrospect, the Meiji Restoration stands out not just because of how rapidly Japan had modernized, but because of how effectively it retained its cultural identity while doing so. Unlike colonized nations that were often forced to adopt foreign systems wholesale, Japan selectively imported what it needed: Western science, technology, and governance models, while maintaining its language, religion, and imperial traditions. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 was one of the most consequential turning points in modern history. What began as a reaction to foreign pressure turned into a proactive redefinition of national identity. It's an example of how a single event, when met with strategic vision and institutional reform, can just cascade into transformative global change. Number 1. The Agricultural Revolution and the Rise of Civilization. Roughly 10,000 years ago, something happened in human history that would permanently change the course of our civilizations. The shift didn't happen due to conquest, empire building, or even technological innovation in the conventional sense. Instead, it was triggered by a change in how humans acquired food. What had once been a nomadic hunter-gatherer way of life gave way to settled agriculture. This simple, fundamental change, commonly referred to as the Agricultural Revolution, may appear deceptively simple. People began planting crops and domesticating animals, but the ripple effects were massive. It was this transition that enabled the creation of permanent settlements, the growth of cities, the rise of governments, writing systems, and organized religion. Without it, the world as we know it, structured and deeply interconnected, would not exist. The Agricultural Revolution, also known as the Neolithic Revolution, began independently in several parts of the world, but the most prominent early developments took place in the Fertile Crescent. That's a region that spans part of modern-day Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, Jordan, and Egypt. This crescent-shaped area provided the ideal conditions: a moderate climate, rich soil, and an abundance of wild grasses and animals that could be domesticated. Now, the first major consequence of agriculture was sedentarism, the establishment of permanent settlements, where once humans had traveled great distances to follow herds and forage, they could now just remain in one location, building homes and developing villages. It allowed for food surpluses, which in turn enabled some members of society to engage in activities other than food production. For the first time, a division of labor emerged. Some people became artisans, priests, or administrators, and this laid the groundwork for the development of social stratification. But with stratification came inequality. Agricultural communities began to form hierarchies based on wealth, land ownership, and control of resources. Elites emerged who controlled the storage and distribution of food. Those who controlled surplus food wielded power, and political structures began to take shape. Over time, these power structures evolved into proto-governments, complete with rules, authority figures, and systems of enforcement. This was the birth of organized governance. As settlements grew larger, they then evolved into urban centers. One of the earliest known cities, Çatalhöyük in modern-day Turkey, dates to around 7500 BCE and had a population of several thousand. With the settled-down life came new technologies and innovations. Pottery was developed to store grains and liquids. Tools for farming, like plows, sickles, and irrigation systems, became more refined. All of these changes increased productivity, which in turn supported population growth and more ambitious planning. The spread of agriculture wasn't limited to just the Fertile Crescent. Independent agricultural revolutions happened in the Yellow River Basin in China, Mesoamerica, the Andes, Sub-Saharan Africa, and New Guinea, each with its own staple crops and domesticated animals. In China, millet and rice farming led to complex societies along the Yellow and Yangtze rivers. In the Americas, maize, which is corn, beans, and squash, formed the basis of agricultural life, giving rise to civilizations like the Maya, the Olmec, and the Inca. The reverberations of the agricultural revolution are still felt today. The idea of property ownership, taxation, cities, bureaucracy, written law, and even the calendar, organized around planting and harvesting seasons, are rooted in the shift to agriculture. This revolution wasn't a single event. It was a turning point of magnitude. It happened independently across the globe, but in each case, it restructured the human relationship with nature, time, and our societies. The shift from foraging to farming triggered a cascade of transformations that redefined what it meant to be human. It allowed for planning and permanence. It created surplus and hierarchy. It enabled writing, cities, and civilizations, and in doing so, it set in motion every major development that followed. From ancient empires to the digital age, the agricultural revolution was, in every sense, the first domino.